Well, Nova's here. My name is Greg Horn. I want to talk to you today about how to have a successful failure. Yesterday, we looked at some people that they learned to fail forward. Talked about Truett Cathy with Chick-fil-A, Mary Kay Ash, both people of faith, but overcame a lot of obstacles to fail forward. And shared some information from the John Maxwell book, a former pastor who became a leadership expert. He had a book called Failing Forward that I was fortunate to be in back in a little over 20 years ago. And man, if you missed yesterday's program, I really, really hope that you'll go listen to that 14-minute program. I think you'll be greatly encouraged if you're dealing with some failures in your personal or professional life. But today I want to focus on the second part of a talk I did up in Cynthiana, Kentucky back a couple weeks ago called How to Have a Successful Failure. They had a leadership conference. They called it a breakout leadership conference, and it was just fortunate to do this talk called How to Have a Successful Failure. And I shared the first part of it yesterday, but today I want to share 8 things that will help you have a successful failure. So we're going to have to go through these quickly, but put your seatbelt on, and here we go. The very first thing we got to do is we got to just analyze what went wrong. Get feedback from other people, which leads to really, I think the most important thing, we got to be accountable. We got to own our part. In any failure that we have in life, personally or professionally, we have to see, hey, what role did I play in it? Sometimes it can be 100% your fault. Sometimes it might only be 10%. But we have to own our part, and we have to be accountable if we're going to have a successful failure. And unfortunately, man, we live in a culture that a lot of people just want to play the blame game. Friends, don't be that person. As a follower of Jesus, Jesus said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Own your part. And I've had to learn to own my part in some of my failures, okay? There are several failures over my 59 years of life, okay? We all have them. We just don't like to talk about them. I'm willing to do that because I think the enemy's greatest tool is discouragement. And when we have failures, it keeps us discouraged. It keeps us from being hopeful and moving forward. But you can have a successful failure, but it starts, number one, with being accountable. A second thing that we need to do if we're going to have a successful failure is we got to reframe our mindset. Reframe our mindset. It's really, really true, friends. I've talked to you about one of the best books I've ever read is The Battlefield of the Mind by Joyce Meyer. And that really does require us to have to reframe our minds and how we look at things and have just a different focus and just reframe how we look at failure. John Maxwell, we talked about yesterday, the difference between achieving people and unsuccessful people is their perception and their response to failure. And so if you're going to have a successful failure, you got to reframe your mindset. And a third thing that I think is really, really important, looking at that reframing your mindset, let me stay here at point 2 for just a second. We got to view it as an opportunity to learn and build a foundation for success. When you're reframing your mindset, I've been guilty of looking in the rearview mirror and wanting to live in the past because of unwise decisions I made or unwise, selfish decisions that others made that's caused me disappointment, heartache, and things. And yet, friends, God wants to meet us right there where we are. But we've got to instead view, if we're going to have a successful failure, view this failure, as an opportunity to learn and to build a foundation for success. Because here's what I know, friends. If we don't make a plan to move forward, which is my third step on how to have a successful failure, if we don't make a plan to move forward, we're not going to move forward. We're going to stay in failure, okay? It's going to be like being in concrete, getting, the concrete dries and you can't move forward. If you don't have a plan, as the old saying goes, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. I love the quote by several people have said it, but I'm going to give head coach Vince Lombardi credit for it. I also know Rachel Hollis. I heard her say it recently on social media. But Vince Lombardi, the coach of the Green Bay Packers, they won the first 2 Super Bowls. He had a great quote. He said, "Hope is not a strategy." Also, I love the word hope. A lot of things are overrated in life, but hope's not one of them. But you know what? Hope is not a strategy. If you're going to have hope, you have to put a plan together, ask for God's help, get some other people to give you input and feedback. Then after you put that plan together, you got to execute it every day. And as a lot of coaches like to say, we just want to get 1% better today. That's our goal, 1% better. And without strategy, you're not going to have hope, and you're not going to be able to have a successful failure. So be encouraged by that today, and know that today, that you have to be intentional. You have to have a plan, and you have to implement and execute that plan if you are going to have a successful failure. But a lot of times that's hard. When you've had a failure, you don't feel confident in putting together a plan. You want to give up. You want to quit. And yet, friends, it's impossible to have a successful failure. But that's what the enemy wants to do, because he is the king of keeping us in disappointment and playing the blame game and wallowing around in our wounds. And yet we all have setbacks and disappointments and failures, friends. A fourth thing that is key in having a successful failure is flexibility is the key. Flexibility is key. I mean, one of the things I learned when I had $1 million territory with Hershey Chocolate, it's been, oh my goodness, hard to believe this, but almost 30 years ago. And one of the things I learned from my boss, he just said, Greg, flexibility is the key to being successful in this business. And I was about ready to be promoted to a district manager before I bought my grocery store. And, I'm so thankful that I heard that from him, a long time ago, because it's true. He said, we put together a plan each day that we're going to work, but sometimes we have to go take care of a problem with another customer or a retail store or a wholesaler. And he just said, flexibility is the key. And sometimes I've not been flexible in my personal life or professional life, and God's helped me to learn that sometimes you got to bend a little bit, got to be a little flexible, especially if you're going to have a successful failure. And the better way to say it, what do you mean by flexibility is a key, Greg, to having a successful failure? What I'm basically trying to say is, friends, we just need to make adjustments as needed. We just need to make adjustments as needed. And it can be a big game changer for us both personally and professionally. A fifth thing to do if we're going to have a successful failure in our life is to cultivate resilience. Cultivate resilience. After COVID hit, I had some friends of mine ask me to put together a talk about how to have resilience after coming out of COVID. So many people were discouraged and distraught, and we know what a trying season it was. It's hard to believe that that's been a little over 5 years now. And yet there's a lot of things that we can learn from that, and one of them was we learned how to cultivate resilience. Here's what I know about resilience, friends. Resilience is a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. And that's something that we all would like to, we want to be stronger in our health. Well, resilience helps our faith too. The Bible talks about that with perseverance. It produces character in us. I believe that's in the book of James. And I have to admit, that's how I've grown the most in my faith, is when I've gone through trials and tribulations, some of which resulted in failures in an area of my life, both personally and professionally. But we can cultivate resilience, friends, by walking through a challenging season of life, walking through a deep valley, and just asking God to show you which way to go, asking what's next in my life. What do you have for me, God? And knowing that God's going to meet you right there. A sixth thing to do if you're going to have a successful failure is, friends, you got to throw the rearview mirror away. You got to throw the rearview mirror away. And what I mean by that is, friends, you can't keep looking back to the past. Yeah, it's okay to visit there, but you just can't set up camp there, friends. It's easy to go back and reminisce, and, it's okay to spend a couple minutes there, but you can't set up camp there. You cannot move forward and have a successful failure if you don't learn to throw the rearview mirror away. And, man, you just don't want to look back. The Bible in the Old Testament, how Lot's wife looked back, and Jesus told him not to look back. God did. I should say Jesus, God did. And told him if it did, you would turn into a pillar of salt. And that's what happened. She looked back, even though God said, don't do that. Look forward. And I know that's a really just graphic visual thinking about that. Just a human devolving into, just a pile of salt. But, friends, that's so true over 2,000 years later, that we can't look in the past. We can't look back. And that's exactly what the enemy wants you to do. I do want to share one quote about resilience that I kind of skipped over a while ago because I was getting pretty passionate about that. But I love what Pastor Dale Bronner says. He says, resilience isn't about how fast you heal, but how well you heal. Say it again. Resilience isn't about how fast you heal, but how well you heal. And friends, that'll really be a game changer for you when you realize that, and that's been my prayer after going through some really disappointing heartaches in my life, is just saying, Lord, I want to heal from these. I like to do it quickly, but I want to do it most of all healthy. And just know, friends, that quite often we're more in a hurry than God is. Amen. All right. A seventh thing to do if we're going to have a successful failure in our life is embrace failure as our friend. Embrace failure as our friend. Coach Rick Pitino said, adversity is the game of life. You're going to have failure. So friends, instead of avoiding it, we need to embrace it. Obviously, we want to have wisdom and take our time, be wise. We talked about that just a minute ago. But we need to learn to embrace failure as our friend. And, 90% of the things that we fail at, man, we can overcome those. Sometimes they do, unfortunately, require a bankruptcy or a surgery, okay? But the fact of the matter is, friends, we got to learn to embrace failure as our friend and not be in fear of it, because I've learned when we're in fear of it, it can lead to failures. And I've been guilty of that, so I can say that from experience. So I want to encourage you to change your mindset. We talked about it earlier about reframing your mindset and learn to say, you know what, I'm going to embrace failure as my friend. As we talked about yesterday's program, John Maxwell such a great quote about failure. Failure is an event, not a person. We'll say it again. Failure is an event, not a person. And last but not least, if you're going to have a successful failure, you got to learn to grieve the loss. I know that the church world, we can hear that, but a lot of times in the real world, as I like to call it, which, I spent several years in before going into ministry at the age of 36, we've got to allow ourselves to grieve a loss. We've got to allow ourselves to feel the emotions after we have a failure. Emotions like anger, sadness. But we can't let our professional failure lead into a personal failure. And that is so easy to do, friends. And that's one of the things I've learned by talking with a friend of mine that owns a human resource company. Just said that, they're having to help learn leaders and managers and business owners that they've got to help their employees, not just with obviously doing their jobs, but with their mental and emotional health. Because if things aren't going well at home, it's always going to parlay into, it's going to just flow over into the workplace. And so many times we don't grieve a loss. Eventually we're going to, friends, but it could rear its head in an ugly way. And if we don't deal with failure, whether it's personal failures or professional failures, it's going to result in some damage in our lives, in our careers, and it's just not a good situation. So I want to encourage you today, if you've had a loss, to take some time to grieve with it, okay? And before you move on to the next thing, because if not, the wounds from that are going to rear its ugly head. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but if you've been blessed by this program, I hope you'll share it with somebody else, whether you're listening to an app like Podbean, iTunes, Spotify, or remind you that we have a YouTube channel. Thanks for watching. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. My name's Greg Horn, and this is Hope is Here.